It's the 11th of April 1963, and Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons are about to become parents. The couple live in Wales, but are currently in Yemen for Aubrey's work. He's a Royal Air Force technician deployed in Arden. Gloria and Aubrey are delighted to be bringing identical twin baby girls, June and Jennifer, into the world, and the babies emerge healthy, without incident. As the years progress, however, it becomes clear that something is amiss. The twins begin to exhibit rather strange behaviour, unlike anything recognised at the time, and quite dissimilar to anything we see today. We'll go into exactly what shortly, but what started as a strange behavioural quirk gradually developed into a seriously strange set of events that raise many questions about psychology, human willpower, connection, and just how much control we have over our grip on life. This is the story of the Silent Twins. Welcome to Campfire Archives. Now, this is a new one for you, if I'm right in thinking that, right?
Yeah, I've never heard of this, not familiar with the Silent Twins at all. Yeah, I do love any time we're talking about identical twins, though, because you have that identical biology, so whatever differences there might be between them is usually nurture, if I'm not mistaken.
And of course, it is another one that happens on UK soil as well. I know you're always a fan of them.
Brilliant. A little bit closer to home, just makes it a bit more real.
So before we tell the story of June and Jennifer Gibbons, let's examine a little bit of backstory. Gloria and Aubrey, they weren't born in Wales. They immigrated from Barbados to the UK in the early 1960s. They arrived as part of the Windrush generation, so they were amongst the hundreds of individuals invited to the UK from the Caribbean in a British effort to fill vacant jobs and rebuild the country after the ravages of World War II. The couple initially settled in Coventry, where Aubrey trained for a career as an RAF technician, while Gloria was a housewife. June and Jennifer were not the Gibbons' only children. Greta had been born in 1957, David in 1959, and eventually Rosie in 1967. The family had relocated to Haverfordwest in Wales in 1974 and would relocate again several times following Aubrey's work commitments around the country. From the moment they could form complex thoughts and perform basic actions, June and Jennifer were inseparable. As young toddlers, they spent every waking moment together, utterly unwilling to spend time by themselves. Now, that's not that strange, but what happened when the children hit speaking age was. Gloria and Aubrey noted that as soon as June and Jennifer were able to talk, they suffered from what seemed to be the exact same speech impediment. Their speech at first was quiet and unintelligible, and even their parents couldn't really understand a word they said. This only intensified as June and Jennifer grew older. As children, the twins would exclusively speak to one another. They would not even converse with their parents or older siblings. Interestingly, until the age of 11, they would occasionally speak in fully formed English with their sister Rosie, involving her in imagination games with dolls. When communicating with anybody else, they would simply gesture or point to things they wanted, and as they grew older still, they never uttered a word to anybody on the street, any medical professionals, or anybody at school. When June and Jennifer conversed with each other, they spoke to each other in their own inaudible dialect. This is now thought to have been a quiet, severely sped up and distorted version of Bajan Creole. This, combined with their speech impediment, made it sound as though they were constantly speaking to each other in a made-up, unidentified language. Nobody could ever interpret what they were saying, but the girls understood one another as clear as day.
Can I just ask a question there, Tom?
Absolutely.
So, I've never heard of... I've heard of Creole before, but I've never heard of Bajan Creole, was it? Is this something they could have picked up from their parents?
Absolutely, yeah. So their parents were fluent Bajan Creole speakers. Whether or not they picked this version of it up from them, I mean, I don't believe they did. I think that must have been, for them to be speaking like that and their parents to not be understanding it, I would have guessed that that's something that came entirely from them.
That's still really interesting, isn't it? Because even if it is Bajan Creole, the fact that their mum and dad can't understand them shows how it's a almost bastardized version of it, for lack of a better term, doesn't it?
Yeah, so they found it impossible to keep up with the rate that they were speaking. It was really, really hard to follow, distorted because of the speech impediment. There was basically no way that anybody but each other could interpret what they were saying, but yeah, they understood each other perfectly. Sadly, things only got worse for June and Jennifer, now dubbed the Silent Twins from here. The family relocated once more to, of all places, Yorkshire, where the Gibbons twins started school. Unfortunately, they were bullied horribly for what the other children perceived to be unnatural, creepy behaviour, to the point where school staff would often advise they go home early to help them avoid the worst of it. Staff at the school advised that June and Jennifer should undergo speech therapy, and they did briefly. The treatment would ultimately do them no good, as they could not even bring themselves to speak to the therapist in any capacity. The older the twins got, the more reserved they became to outsiders, and their own secret language just seemed to get more and more complex. The older the twins got, the more reserved they became to outsiders, and their own secret language just seemed to get more and more complex by the day. Thus began a long journey in 1974 to find June and Jennifer a suitable therapist. Time and time again, medical professionals would try different approaches in an attempt to get each girl to open up, with not a shred of success. Throughout this time, the twins continued to attend school but refused to partake in any reading or writing exercises, despite the fact that both of them were more than capable of reading and writing and they really enjoyed it. As a result, they struggled even more severely with school life. Eventually, Aubrey and Gloria, their parents, tried a different tactic. They sent June and Jennifer to 2 different boarding schools in the hopes that splitting them up would snap them into some form of sociability. It failed miserably, and both girls, unbeknownst to the other, entered a heightened state of catatonia. They became rigid, unresponsive to anyone or anything, and seemed to enter an immensely deep state of depression. It was almost as though they were connected on a deeper level. To prevent any further stress to the girls, their parents had them reunited in the family home. They spent the next several years sequestered in their shared bedroom, continuing their imagination games. Around this time, Gloria and Aubrey were glad to see the first semblance of a breakthrough in their daughters. The twins became massively enthused in creative writing, developing many plays and stories which they would perform and read to one another in their room. What seemed like a gift, however, soon took a darker turn. The girls began writing rather dark stories, often centered around plots involving young people acting strangely or criminally. In one of June's, entitled The Pepsi Cola Addict, an American high school-age boy is inappropriately seduced by a teacher, then routinely abused by the guards upon his confinement in a reformatory.
And how old are they at this point, Tom?
They are young teenagers.
Okay.
Yeah. Amazingly, the twins actually managed to get this one published by Vanity Press, pulling their family's unemployment benefits together to pay for it. Strangely enough, I don't really think it ended up as a bestseller. They wrote a great deal of these books, but none of them would ever be published again. What are you thinking so far?
This is why I love stories about identical twins, because it always centers on this really bizarre connection that they seem to have. A couple of things that spring to mind. Out of interest, I wonder, with this language that seems to be developing over time and growing in complexity, is it a case that they are sitting down in their room and coming up with new ways to say different things, coming up with new terms, developing it actively? Or is it just a case that as they're speaking, it's growing and growing? Does that make sense, in complexity and developing that way? That, to me, I'm like, I'd love to know how this language is developing, as you say. The other thing is, I find it so interesting the way they both went catatonic. With no contact from each other. They effectively had exactly the same symptom, as if they have that link between each other.
Just a complete state of hyperdependency.
Exactly. And I totally empathise with the parents, because that would be my first thought. Well, this isn't working. They're never going to create a friendship group. If they're together, let's separate them. And it, completely backfires, because they both have that exact same reaction. Really interesting.
Well, it's all about to get much darker and much, much weirder, I'm afraid. As the girls turned into teenagers, they became deeply troubled and began drifting towards the fringes of society. It all started in the early 1980s when June and Jennifer began experimenting with drugs and alcohol, which ultimately sent them deeper down the rabbit hole of petty crime. June and Jennifer began to rack up quite the rap sheet and committed acts of vandalism, arson and petty theft throughout the early 80s. In late 1981, they were finally arrested, put on trial, and they were found guilty of their crimes, but were deemed unfit to be sentenced to a stint in prison. Instead, in 1982, the twins were sentenced to a period of indefinite detention in the dreaded Broadmoor Hospital under the Mental Health Act. Here they would stay in appalling conditions for the next 11 years of their lives. Life in Broadmoor was unbearable for the twins. Psychiatrists and legal officials described the hospital as non-stop parties and discos compared to prison. In reality, they were locked up alongside many of Britain's most dangerous and unstable criminals there, many of them male. Ronnie Cray and Peter Sutcliffe, the infamous Yorkshire Ripper, were confined to the same hospital at the same time, and there was a constant environment of fear and uncertainty. Even more appallingly, there was, of course, an extreme disregard for the safety of Broadmoor patients in the 1980s. It was one of the many institutions where the late disgraced Jimmy Savile was committing his heinous abuses of power. The twins were unnecessarily put on an extremely high dose of antipsychotic drug, which inflicted innumerable side effects, blurred vision and extreme fatigue being just a few, which led them to ultimately abandon their main hobby, writing. June believed that they were being held indefinitely due to their unwillingness to speak, and with her waning energy desperately penned letters to the highest authorities in Britain. She contacted the Home Office, the courts, even the Queen herself, asking for a pardon, but received no response. Now, with the twins in the lowest pits of despair, the story takes a particularly bizarre turn. During their time in Broadmoor, the girls began to develop a strange obsession with the idea of their own deaths. They began to wholeheartedly believe that both of them could never be free together. One of them would have to sacrifice themselves for the other one to live a normal life. If one of them were to pass, they believed the other would be able to speak and live freely, happily.
I mean, I know where this is going.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately. And can I just say as well, Tom, you said it was petty crime they were committing. For those of you who aren't from the UK, Broadmoor is infamous as being one of, if not the worst.
A brutal mental institution.
Horrific. Exactly. Like Tom said, the Yorkshire Ripper was there. I'm surprised that's where they ended up. I mean, that's maybe an avenue we don't have time to go down, but these two sounded like they needed help rather than effectively what is imprisonment.
11 years.
11 years in such a horrific hospital.
11 years for petty crime amongst Britain's worst criminals.
It doesn't make sense to me.
Not at all. So it was Jennifer that believed that it was she who should take the bullet and die for her sister. One night in the March of 1993, Jennifer simply uttered the words to June, "I'm going to have to die." The next day, the two were unexpectedly moved to the slightly more open Caswell Clinic in Bridgend, Wales. On arrival, Jennifer entered an unconscious state from which she could not be roused. She died later that day in the hospital of acute myocarditis, a form of sudden inflammation of the heart.
Oh my God.
The coroner examined her body, found no evidence of drugs, poison, or foul play. It was as though she had simply willed her own death into existence. She was just 29 years old.
Did they know they were being transferred that day?
No. No, they had no idea.
That's wild.
As I'm telling this, the hairs on my arms are standing on end. It is a really freaky moment.
Ditto. I can't wrap my head around that. There's two things that are so perplexing there. One, the fact they didn't know they were being moved, but she knew tomorrow would be the day.
It was, I need to die. I'm going to have to die. And off she went.
And number two, that she then has this heart issue that kills her.
Which is almost like she died of a broken heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I assume it's the kind of thing you can't feel coming.
Well,
you don't know a heart attack's coming, do you?
I guess not. There is a little bit that touches on that in a moment.
Okay.
But I don't think that it would have been something that was going on for a long, long time, because I guess the staff at the hospital would have known about it.
Sure.
If they cared. And something would have been addressed. I mean, amazingly, the story doesn't end here. So Marjorie Wallace, a journalist working with the Sunday Times, approached June shortly after her sister's passing. To her surprise, June opened her mouth and in perfect, clear English said, "I'm free at last, liberated, and at last Jennifer has given up her life for me." June likened it to a massive tsunami washing over her, cleansing her of all her sins and allowing her to finally live a life free of her condition. She then told Wallace that Jennifer had not been herself across the final 24 hours of her life. She was subdued, her speech appeared slurred even to June. On the ride over to Caswell Clinic, Jennifer had slept, her eyes open, with her head resting on June's lap. By the time they arrived, she was too far gone to save. Now, there is a bit of a silver lining. So June was subsequently released from custody following her sister's death. It's a terrible shame that it took that to have her released. The two had supposedly had a long-standing agreement where if one of them passed away, the other would do their best to speak and live their life normally. By 2008, June was living a quiet, happy life near her parents in Wales, and she's no longer being monitored by psychiatric services. Journalists were able to reach her older sister, Greta, in 2016, who said that June blames Broadmoor for ruining their lives. Aubrey and Gloria had to convince her to not file a lawsuit against the hospital, as it would not help to bring her sister back. What do you think?
I wonder a few things. You said they were on quite heavy antipsychotic medication.
Yeah.
So in theory, like any delusions or what have you, they might have been having, or doctors might have assumed they were having, were presumably suppressed. So how does that happen? How do you have that thought when you're very heavily medicated, in a way that should suppress, I would imagine, those kinds of feelings? And then it's so accurate. And then I can't explain how June comes around, for lack of a better term, and can then speak normally for the first time in her entire life, basically.
It's almost like a light switch is flipped.
And she knew this was going to happen.
Supposedly so, yeah. That was the pact that she had with her sister, that if one of them died, the other would then be able to speak.
I mean, what is going on here, Tom?
It's insane, isn't it?
Again, this is why I love stories like this about identical twins. There's clearly some kind of deep-seated connection there that, I don't know, is it just the way they've been brought up? Are they just that close because they're so alike? Or is there something we don't understand about a twin's brain? It's absolutely baffling.
A really, really strange case. We do have some time for some theories, and there are a few. It does appear that perhaps there is a psychological explanation, albeit one that we don't fully understand. It's just such an unusual case that part of me really wants to believe that there is something more to it. So, looking at it from a psychological perspective, psychiatrists and psychologists have found the case extremely difficult to diagnose and classify. They blame an extreme degree of codependency on one another, severe elective mutism, or even folie à deux, so a shared delusional disorder, the constant changes in their environments as they moved around as children, the bullying at school, and eventually their lengthy sentence in Broadmoor may have started and then contributed to the severity of their problem. As far as I'm aware and as far as I've read, I don't believe there was any abuse when they were children that would put them into a state such as that. It remains a really, really tricky one to classify. And I know next to nothing about psychology, so perhaps I'm not the person that should be bringing up psychological theories, but how do you explain that away?
The problem I have with that is it sounds like, unfortunately, they were on this path before the bullying, before they went to Broadmoor, before the heavy medication.
And I'm not entirely certain that just moving house a lot as a kid would cause you to enter such a powerful state of this.
Codependency, yeah. No, I agree. I think, at least from what you've said, I think this was always what was going to happen. You have children who grow up where both siblings, especially in like the US, travel around army bases all their lives. They don't develop relationships like this where they can't speak to other kids. Like, yeah, I don't buy it. I think they were always on this path to being extremely codependent. And although it was probably exacerbated by things like bullying and going into Broadmoor, I think it was always going to happen.
Really unsettling, but and it's incredibly sad. It's an incredibly sad story, but it does give you that little that shiver. It's strange.
It is. It's sad throughout, even before we end up sadly where it ends in Broadmoor. For these two girls, or not Broadmoor, but in psychiatric care. Even the schooling, it breaks my heart to think, because they will have been savagely bullied, like back in the 80s.
In a British public school.
A British public school, British state school, two children who aren't British, or are they British, sorry? Their parents aren't
They've been raised in Britain for almost all their lives, but their parents are from Barbados.
Right, so part of the Windrush generation, you said. So they're already probably struggling to fit in and dealing with some racism back in the 80s especially. Yeah. And then to be twins, to not really speak to anybody in English. God, yeah. Like, I can't imagine how rough an upbringing these kids had, unfortunately.
So we do have a few more theories. It almost seems in a little bit of a way insensitive to talk about this being associated with the paranormal. I mean, one of these theories comes from June herself. The other two are leaning quite heavily into speculation. But we have first the idea of the two twins being an unnatural extension of one another. They themselves believe this. They believe that they were essentially living clones, so twin versions of the exact same person. The speculative idea of them sharing one consciousness has been explored by some observers. Essentially, this would be akin to the idea of spiritual possession, so by, let's say, your hypothetical demons and ghosts and spirits, but where each twin was partially possessing the other. What do you think to that?
Whenever we tread into this territory, I've always got to be careful because, we just don't know. And
of course, yeah, I don't want to turn what's potentially a very sensitive case into something just wildly clickbaity and speculative.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think we try and avoid that. However, and the fact that she's almost opened that door and said this is what she believes, this To me, when I hear this and other similar stories of identical twins, of which there are a lot, which is why I find it so interesting, that to me is how it always sounds. Like there is a real part of them within each other. Like it sounds like they are sharing some kind of joint consciousness. Like I say, the science of it, I've no idea. Who does? But do I sometimes think there is more to us and we are more connected than we know? Yes, I sometimes flirt with that idea. Granted, it sounds a little bit fanciful maybe, but I don't know, Tom. But could there be something to it? I absolutely think there could be. I'm not convinced there isn't.
Of course. You mean you look at spiritual and religious beliefs from the dawn of time, and there will be the notion that we are all connected. We are all much more in tune with one another in the world than we'd like to admit from a scientific perspective.
I mean, not to almost sound flippant with it, but to me, it's almost like the equivalent of you think about someone and then they happen to text you or they call you within 5 seconds. And again, that could just be pure coincidence. But I do sometimes feel when it comes to identical twins, it's dialed up to 11. And I don't know. It just really, in this case, feels like there's more to them than meets the eye.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. So going off the rails a little bit here, and I'm going to go out on a limb first of all and say that I do not agree with this theory. Something that links into what we actually spoke about in our last episode, the Mary Celeste. But for those who lean into the paranormal, they discuss the idea that the twins were the victims of a quote-unquote curse. One that could only be broken with one of their own deaths. Some view this as essentially a prophecy that came true, with Jennifer seemingly dying on command, followed by her sister's almost instantaneous ability to speak again. I mean, we said it last time, but I don't put much bearing in curses. I don't think that the twins were cursed. I think there is a much more rational explanation, let's say, than the devil did it.
Yeah, and I don't know, even if we pull that thread, okay, well, who cursed them?
Exactly, yeah.
For what reason are these kids cursed? They sound so in tune with themselves and their bodies, for lack of a better term. And when I say that, I mean she clearly knew she was going to die. It was such an out-there prediction and so on the nose. She clearly had a strong inkling she was going to die. I don't know, Tom, it felt to me almost like more of a sacrifice, if that makes sense. It felt like she was
doing it for her sister.
Doing it for her sister. Almost like she was encouraging this to happen, as opposed to just being aware of it. Which, again, if we're going to pull that thread of curses, and I totally agree with you, but if we're going to bear with it for a moment, it doesn't sound like it's an external force.
No.
It sounds like she's doing this to herself to effectively save her sister.
Yeah, 100%. It feels like something that they were, I hate to say in control of, but it did feel that there was maybe an element of control, especially if, as you say, Jennifer is just seemed to be essentially dying on command.
Absolutely. I totally agree. It felt like I say, like a sacrifice almost to save her sister.
And then the final theory here, which again, it does err on the side of nonsensicality, but it's one that I do like a lot more than the idea of it being a curse. The idea of it being a deeper spiritual human connection. So could some people be so spiritually or metaphysically in tune with one another that it affects them detrimentally or positively? Could the twins see or sense something that other people could not within each other, essentially linking them together as literal soulmates? I like this theory the most, as I said, but I really don't know how much credibility I can give it without concrete evidence. It's somewhat comforting and might even point to the idea that there's much more to our existence than what we see.
Definitely. And I couldn't have put it better myself. I really like this idea. I need more evidence.
Yeah.
Can we ever have more evidence to this? I don't know, but I really enjoy it as an idea. Part of me does think, usually with identical twins, to me it almost feels like it's often the other way around, where when one dies, the other one feels great trauma, etc., or goes into a deep depression. It's interesting this one flips the script and one can't survive without the other, and I wonder why that is and why that differs from, what I'd consider to be a quote-unquote normal case of identical twins.
Yeah, so from what I hear with the conclusion of the story, it seems like the main emotion running through June was anger at Broadmoor that this had to happen in the first place. I think
Okay.
she was sad that she lost her sister. They were best friends, but also, the first thing that she said to the journalist was, "I'm free." It was like a weight had been lifted, like a wave had washed over her, and she was able to be herself again.
Is there ever any indication, Tom, as to whether if they didn't end up in Broadmoor, this would have had to happen? And what I mean is, would one day one of them had to have died? Do you get that impression?
I guess it's really hard to say, isn't it? Because the reason they ended up in Broadmoor was because they started off down this path of committing petty crimes and taking drugs and drinking a lot. Perhaps we can say that maybe they were doing those drugs and drinking because they were distressed by their experiences from school. Perhaps it might have just been one long vicious cycle or corridor of bad events until we got to one of them passing away. But it is an interesting area of thought, isn't it? Maybe if they hadn't gone to Broadmoor, maybe if they'd been given the help that they needed instead, maybe there would have been a happier ending to the story. You never know.
Yeah, because part of me thought, well, again, maybe it was a case that what they needed was to be separated. But we've been there, done that, haven't we? And it didn't work. In fact, the opposite. It really quite badly backfired. So, I don't know. I just find this whole thing so interesting and puzzling.
So, June has since given interviews on her life story. You'll be happy to know that she's alive and well to this day. The story has been retold in books, music, television shows, movies, and of course, podcasts. Despite the harrowing story of June's life and the tragic loss of Jennifer, there's a silver lining in the sense that the former has been able to live a calm life in the aftermath of the ordeal. It remains, however, one of the most haunting cases in British history and raises so many perplexing questions about what goes on deep within the human psyche. Is there more to our minds and bodies than we might care to admit? Please let us know what you think in the comments. I've been Tom, this has been Niall, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening until the end of this podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us, you can follow us on Instagram at campfire_archives or send us an email at hello.campfirearchives@gmail.com. If you'd like to submit a story, ask us a question, or even join us for an episode, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.